Hello and welcome to this BioProcess International Ask the Expert webcast. I'm your host, Leah Rosen, the online editor for BioProcess International. Before we get started, just a couple of notes. This webcast is being recorded and will be made available for replay in the multimedia section of our website. We've muted the audio lines, but we welcome you to type in your questions for our speaker in the chat window on your screen. After the presentation, we will begin the question and answer portion, and I will ask our speaker your questions from the chat window. Your questions from the chat window will only be visible to myself and our speaker. So thank you for joining us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Martin Laferriere from Avid Bioservices.
Thank you, Leah, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. As Leah mentioned, I'm Martin Laferriere, Director of IT Systems Compliance at Avid Bioservices. A quick background, I've been working in the validation of computerized systems for over 20 years now. I've been involved with a lot of software systems, including ERPs, LIMS, drug safety, EDMS, QMS, and lab systems, and much more than that over my long career. I've worked also in preclinical, clinical, pharmaceutical. I've also worked as a consultant in the pharma industry, and now I work at Avid Bioservices. And speaking of Avid, we're an experienced biologics CDMO, or contract development and manufacturing organization, with over 14 years of commercial manufacturing history and an excellent regulatory track record. We've been in business for 26 years now, and we manufacture biopharmaceuticals approved in and marketed in 18 countries. We just commissioned a brand new state-of-the-art process development lab on our campus here in Tustin in Orange County, California. Today, I'm going to speak about software risk management, and more specifically about the one I favor. There are multiple models, but this is a short presentation, so I have to concentrate on only one of them. The approach itself of managing risk evolves within each organization through audits, prior experience. It can tailor the management and approach to system quality. The risk management and evaluation should be an integrated part of your validation process, and in that way it's possible to reduce testing by documenting your risk, actual use, and your regulation impact. So risk management for a lot of people is viewed as more work and more documentation, but if you have enough structure to identify what and how you're going to test based on an pre-agreed upon risk, it can save a lot of time. It's very dependent on the size of the system, and the bigger it is, the bigger the reward you'll have at the end of the project. The pendulum displayed here on screen is also a warning, because if the process is not structured enough, you can't be consistent, and you might get in trouble for your risk evaluation be too vague. If the process is on the other side overly restrictive, it'll result in a lot of excursion because it's too structured and you can't really fit every system into it. If it's defined enough to be useful and vague enough to be flexible, then the gray areas, your professional judgment can be used to push the result towards the actual good result, a good, meaningful, risk-based approach, basically. How do you save money, time, and maintain high quality? It's the proverbial unicorn of project management. The following slide, of course, are not to be taken exactly to reflect where you are at your company right now, your professional environment. One thing that I've learned is that even though the rules and regulation are really the same for everybody on paper, in real life for each company does things differently, obviously, unless they're lacking in their process, but it works for them at the moment mostly. Each company is different because of the complexity with managing risk-based processes, politics, prior experience with their clients or health authorities, and even because of the company's size. I wanted to start with a quick and true personal anecdote on risk management and risk impact. This story actually happened to me during an audit of an ERP system at a previous company I worked at. And we had a couple, during the audit, we had a couple intermittent dead spots in the warehouse. The auditor actually noticed one of them during a tour and was questioning me and the head of quality back in the audit room about what was our workaround for handheld devices when we lost signal. We referred to the alternative and proceduralized process of stepping back from the dead spot, wait for the connection, and manually re-entering the data entering the data. But he was not satisfied, and he actually started requesting heavily into our validation of that part of the system, and specifically about the handheld devices and what happens when they disconnect. This is going to be a long day of pulling and prepping document, as you've experienced yourself during audits and inspections. But in a moment of non-filtered impulse talking, I guess it was early morning, believe me, and the quality person gave me, what are you doing? Look, I asked the auditor, why are you so focused on the dead spot? If the device is not connected and we can't enter data during the disconnection, we can't enter the wrong information since it doesn't work. There's no risk. It's annoying for our operations and slows us down, but nothing can actually happen. At that point, the auditor actually paused and eventually turned to us and said, I didn't see it that way. You guys have a good day. I'm done on the subject. And the quality head and myself were really surprised, and we actually almost ran out of the audit room hoping they didn't come back to us. What the point of the story is that even if the actual auditor didn't expect testing where there's no risk, and in this case it was a severity. So yes, the function actually failed because it couldn't connect and enter the data, but the consequences were a low risk since you couldn't enter data or break anything or delete data or modify data. So to start with the risk process, how do you appropriately evaluate a system without spending an enormous amount of time on building a big assessment report with a lot of manual entries, explanation, justification, mitigations, and endless reviews? The first thing I learned is that forms are really important to simplify and create a consistent way to accomplish that. Obviously, you need to have a solid base to start, which is a good set of procedure on how and where you manage your risk. The first assessment should come for the system as a whole. What's its risk and other basic things that need to be documented consistently for all the system. And by that, I mean as part of your change control. You should determine at least if your system is GXP or not, why you took that decision, and make it as simple as possible in your assessment. Documenting why you're doing that, it's useful during an audit. If they're questioning your decision of the system being GXP or not GXP, you can just bring out the form and you have the explanation, you have a process around it, and the auditor should be satisfied the way you took your decision. Then if the system is GMP, you can add other components to the assessment. So what is the regulatory risk of that system to the product and the company? What is the system categorization, like GAP or other guidances you want to use? And then gather all this together to get an overall risk for low, medium, or high for the system as a whole. In this system, you can also document regulation like SOX, GDPR, HIPAA, and other regulation that are not necessarily GMP or GXP, but should be evaluated for your system, which is important for your company and compliance in other areas. You can also add if the system is going to use electronic signature, if it will require a vendor audit, all that. If you put it in a form-based system, you'll never forget anything, and it'll be filed away and consistent for every system. And if you want to get fancy and have bigger system in-house like ERPs, like big systems like have multiple modules, you can get fancy and re-implement that form to evaluate module on top of that. So you can even divide between your GMP modules and non-GXP modules, and then you can start saying, well, non-GXP system I won't look at, non-GXP modules I won't look at for the validation. So you're starting to see where you should concentrate your efforts and starting to completely eliminate functionality you don't need to test. Validation one-on-one, just bear with me here. It's just a quick overview so you understand the process of the risk where I'm going to. But validation 101, so how do we decide what to test in the system? So overly simplified, the user define what they want from the system, plus the regulatory requirements like security, audit trail, data integrity, electronic signatures, etc. in the user requirement. Then the specifications describe how the system was configured or customized to actually meet what's defined in those user requirements. Then, as you test you test that functionality that's defined in the specification. So as you see, the requirements are key and the footing of everything it's based upon. So if you don't build your requirements right, you won't test the specification right, and you won't be testing to the intended use. As a side note, I've seen companies before that combines the user and the functional requirements as a single statement, and it works very well to save time when systems are almost predefined for you. The next phase is to build upon the risk of the overall system by evaluating more precisely where to concentrate our efforts within the system itself. And the functional specification is the document I want to highlight here for the next portion of the risk. It's a good pre-existing spot where you have a list of functionality and can do further assessment of the system with more details. Usually when I say this, people get really depressed and they look at me and saying, evaluate each function, really? The investment, this is the investment part where you spend time now and save more time later because the quicker you do it, the less you'll have to do at the end, and that's where actually normally we get pushed to get it faster done faster on the validation side. And validation is not cheap either, so the company should be happy with you doing that, less testing at the end. Functional risk assessment. So how do you do this? What I like to do is simple. So you assess what is the impact of the function on the regulation and compound this with the overall risk of your system itself. You do that for each functional statement in your FS or specification, and at the end you should have a result of high, medium, low, or a spread of high, medium, low across all functionality of the system. And when you put this together, you can actually define what your testing requirement should be directly in your functional spec. Like for any high functionality, like e-signatures or high-risk functionality that touch product directly, will be tested as part of let's say a conventional OQ or UAT or UAT. For medium risk functionality, for example, you might rely on the vendor testing that's already been executed, or internal testing that's done by IT that's documented, or as part of just your PQ or UAT, which would be your standard process of testing your validation, the testing that the system actually works for the user. And this is where the tire hits the road, because whatever happens, a high-risk functionality must be tested since it's relevant to your business and the compliance, even for a lower-risk system. The balance here is really important, and fine-tuning and test driving that assessment is really important, because you have to make sure that you're not letting through too many high-risk. We're not letting through any risk functionality that you forgot to test, basically. So, in summary, using a dichotomous key here, you document the system GXP level and risk level in the change control, thereby excluding and documenting non-GXP systems. If you have modules, then you do the same thing. You can exclude a whole module within the application. You can store those documents as part of your change control, or in a document control or your EDMS if you have one. And then you document your functionality risk within the FS or an analog using the module or system risk. You can further remove testing for lower risk and reduce testing on medium risk, and stay status quo for the higher risk functionality, meaning more testing, less testing, no testing for high, medium, lows. And then the strategy itself can be documented directly in the specification, like I was showing in the previous slide, like where you're testing, how much testing you'll do, or as part of a validation plan or a protocol. Your trace matrix will also contain some of your risk items by default, since you need to explain why some function would not be tested. So the savings in numbers, if we quickly look at numbers, which can change from system to system, obviously, but let's say that we have a distribution of 35% high risk, 45% medium risk, and 20% low risk for this fake system, fictitious system. Traditionally, you'd probably test between 80 and 100% of that functionality for the system, but using a functional base risk here where you reduce your amount of testing for the mediums and you remove testing for the low risk, you'll be doing basically 35% of a traditional validation, 45% of reduced testing or no validation testing properly, except for the PQ, and then no testing actually at the 20% level. So you would reduce significantly the amount of testing that you'll be doing for that system. So in conclusion, documenting your system risk using pre-established criteria help enhance your validation approach, and flexibility is very important. But you can be really, it can make your QA group really uncomfortable if they don't understand the process, if it's not defined well enough. If you have a small system that mostly does higher risk functions, you might want to just test everything instead and save time on the risk assessment. But for the case of a large system, you'll have a good amount of system functionality where you can reduce and remove testing altogether by assessing their risk with this approach. And with the experience of doing validation all those years, you know you always get rushed and pushed and get things done faster as you get closer to the end. So upfront work is smart and will help you streamline and make you look like a hero when you get close to the implementation finish line. All right, that's it for the presentation. I hope you enjoyed this webcast.
Thanks, Martin. So we have some time for some questions. And one question is, what's considered the best practice for assigning each FS as being HM or L? Are there tools or guidelines available someplace?
Can you hear me? Sorry, I didn't hear the question right.
Okay. The question is, what's considered the best practice for assigning each FS as being HM or L? Are there tools or guidelines available?
Oh, for the high, medium, or low? Most people use the GAM5 approach, which is the severity, probability, and detectability. Personally, I prefer getting away from the detectability or the probability. It really depends on your environment, where you're at, and the type of system you have. But usually you go with, is it GXP or not? How close to GXP is it? Is it a direct impact, an indirect impact, or something like that? And then what would it happen if the actual function fails, right? So the severity part of it. But I've seen the way I've seen them implemented changes from company to company. Some use the FMLA process.
Okay. And in your pendulum slide, you say the process should be defined enough but vague enough to be useful. What do you mean by that?
So in some case, your assessment result will be just on the line between, let's say, medium and high. So you have to make it vague enough where if your quality group, your IT group, because it's a technical process in the system, or your validation team or the business itself say, well, this is more high than medium, then that way you can push it one way or the other, kind of cheating in a way, but that's, it's trying to make it as compliant as possible. So at some point, the line will be too big for you to decide which side it should go, if you're using a very black and white approach to this is a high, this is a low. So in this case, you would have to have a group of people that will make that decision if it's high or medium.
Okay, so I think we have time for just one more question. If you haven't had your question answered, Martin will be giving those questions to follow up with individually, but you can keep typing any questions you have in. We'll pass those along. So the last question is, you mentioned that you have seen a combination of requirements and specifications. What do you mean by that? Just have a URFS document?
Yeah, I've had that at a couple companies, and basically, instead of having a UR and an FS, So one UR statement to usually two or three or more FS statements, they would actually combine not just the document, but the statement itself. So instead of having, let's say you have a URFS, which you have one UR and then multiple FS within the document, instead of having that, you would have multiple FS or URFS statements. Not a UR, not an FS, but a combined. So you would have one statement for each. That makes it more efficient, easier to build, because most of the time these days we actually buy software. They're pre-built or templated, and it's just makes no sense for us to have a full UR and a full FS. So it saves time and it's still compliant.
Okay, great. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for joining us. The recorded version of this webcast will be available for on-demand viewing on our website. As a registered attendee, you'll receive a follow-up email providing you with a direct link. We look forward to having you join us at future BioProcess International Ask the Expert webcasts. Look for those announcements in your inbox. Goodbye.